right, so we'll start by reciting our memory passage. We've been reciting or memorizing Colossians 1:9 through, we're up to verse 19. I'll confess I'm still working on this myself. This last couple there's a lot of he is I found. He is. And I get tripped up, so I know I'll look towards the end. So feel free to read along if you need to. The most important thing is that we be transformed by this passage as we meditate on it, and as we make it a regular part of our study and meditation. We'll start in Colossians 1, verse 9, and we'll go all the way through verse 19. As I considered this last verse, especially this week, it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. It struck me that Jesus is undeniable proof that God is not stingy. That not only did God freely give him to us, and that would be proof enough that God isn't stingy, but even more, it was God's good pleasure to allow all of the fullness to dwell in Jesus. That all of the fullness of deity, God said, no, Jesus, you take it, you have it. And I just got such a wonderful picture of the selflessness of God. That not only did he give us Jesus, but God was pleased for all of the fullness of deity to dwell in Jesus. We just sang a second ago, "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord." And we also sang, "It is good to gaze upon God's majesty." And I was thinking as we were singing that Jesus he's the key to our life with God, and beholding his fullness, gazing on his majesty, ought to be what makes our hearts beat. It ought to be the driving hunger of our lives. We might be able to gaze upon his majesty, that we would consider it good to praise him, and that we want the eyes of our hearts open to see him. I had a conversation this week that reminded me how much our attitudes and behavior are shaped by our environment. And it made me think how important it is for our attitudes and our behavior to be shaped by our beholding Jesus. Somebody that I was speaking with was saying, that's just the only example that I've seen. It's the only example that I know. It's all that I saw. And I thought as I was hearing that in this conversation, that's a common excuse for poor behavior or poor attitudes. I don't know any better. And I was just thinking, I was struck in that moment, and then I was struck again singing just now, what a blessing it is that we have the example of Jesus Christ himself, that we have the fullness of deity in human form, who we can gaze upon. And Jesus himself told us, learn from me. Don't learn from your dad. Don't learn from your heritage. Don't learn from your environment. Learn from me. And he invites us to gaze upon him and let our attitudes and behavior be transformed as we behold the fullness of deity, which is in his person. And he purchased the right to reshape our attitudes and behaviors. He purchased the right for us to not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but for us to be transformed by renewing our minds. And as we come to him, we can be transformed by the fullness which was pleased to dwell in him. And the question came to me this week, how do we learn from Jesus? He said, come and learn from me, but how do we do it? And I was just taken back to that passage in Matthew 11, in verses 28 and 29. You can turn there. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and then," I'm inserting the then, "and then learn from me. I can be taught of Jesus, not merely as I study his life and his responses, but rather as I come to him." He says, first thing, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and as I receive his rest. That's the next thing. I come to him, I receive rest from him. I receive the peace of God. And then the next thing is, take my yoke upon you. And as I take my yoke, his yoke upon me, then I learn from him. I think it's easy for me to think, if I need to learn something about the fullness of deity, I gotta go. I think it's great to study the Bible, but I gotta study and I gotta see how the fullness of deity manifests itself. And it is so easy for it to become a thought exercise. What's the fullness of God? Let me look. Let me make sure I understand it. And Again, I was reminded this week, no, the first thing is come to him in that moment of temptation, in the moment of frustration, in a difficult situation. It's not get out my Bible and study and try to find, when did Jesus encounter a situation that most closely resembles my situation? Which is that's how my scientific mind goes, but it's no, come to him, receive rest, and then take his yoke upon me. And that's how I start to learn from him. I don't learn from him by study. I learn from him by walking beside him, by being under his yoke, by bearing my cross, by taking up my cross every day and denying my flesh. And that's how I learn from him. I learn from him as I, in coming to him, receive rest from him, and then place his yoke upon me and walk beside him. And it's as I walk beside him that he begins to teach me. And all the time, I feel like this, I probably sound like a broken record because I say this so many times. I've got to come to him and I've got to let him teach me as I submit to his yoke and I walk with him. And it's then that I can behold the fullness that was pleased to dwell in him. As I submit myself to his yoke, as I deny myself, as I choose to come to him in the moments of my daily life, not choose to just come to the scriptures, but come to Jesus and make sure that I do nothing but come to Jesus, that I then begin to behold in greater and greater degree the fullness which was pleased to dwell in him. And I really get to understand what does it mean, that fullness, and I can be transformed as I behold him as well. So we have a few people who said that they wanted to share today. So, Bobby will start, and then I'll share, and then George, and then Paul, and then Tony. So Bobby, me, George, Paul, and Tony. And then we'll have a time of teaching after that.